someone else's parties in my backyard. I'm going to use this excuse to wear every dress I have. I don't have it.
I should just keep doing it as it is.
Absolutely.
Here, take one, pass it down. Take one, pass them around. All right. All right.
Take one, pass it around. Ole, 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 ole. Peter.
Peterfest. No, surely you are here for me, but really, you are here for all of you. Because without my community, what am I? Just some fucking dude with good hair. And every year... Oh, shoot. Sorry. For those of you who can't see, there's a very nice couple dining next door. But the lady just applauded me. Being as sporting as she is. They all come here for the community. And every year I select one member of my community to give the introductory speech. And this year that person is Ed. Many of you know Ed. Many of you have heard. Many of you read the description of him on the Peterfest Facebook page. I don't need to introduce him beyond that, but I want you to listen to what he has to say right now. Thank you.
All right, we're here to celebrate Peter. A man who has many a time said, I just read a Wikipedia article about. And, you know, we've all been there. But Peter, I think, does it in a different way than most of us. Like, I know when I do it, I'm just finding sort of an interesting factoid to repeat back, just to have some conversational pattern. Peter, when he reads it, like, the first thing he does is transition into like, this weird hypothetical. It's like, do you think this historical event, you know, had anything to do with this other one? Like, Peter has an interesting relationship to history. He's one of the few, like, actual historical materialists I know. He's the walking poster boy for Marx. Like, everybody else sort of treats history like, you know, a fun toy to play with, or like an excuse for not doing anything else. Like, it already failed, why bother? Peter, you know, because of his academic background, understands history as both a discipline and also sort of a space of possibility. And, you know, it's not necessarily what has happened, but what, like, could have happened at any given time. So I think that really, you know, because of this way of his looking at history, he's probably very qualified to give a speech about alternative history, with which he's going to grace us all with right now. So enjoy this history that you're living in, where you get to listen to his speech, because it's the best one out there.
History! Yeah. Many thanks to Ed. Ed is a comrade of incredible power. His power levels are something else to behold. Among other things, feel free, once I descend from the podium here, I'll tell you the story of how we cut into the Nazis today, and how we found where they were meeting, and how we chased them the fuck off. That's what I was doing while I was planning for this shit. When I stopped obsessing over this, I obsessed over fucking up the Nazis. When I stopped obsessing over fucking up the Nazis, I obsessed over this. So, it's traditional to begin with thank yous, and my first thank you is to everybody who came out today to Manchester. I'm aware not all of you could, I'm aware not all of you knew about it, because we have to keep it pretty discreet. But I see a lot of faces out there today who've been on the line with me, and that's the most valuable thing that I have in my life, is all of you. Yeah! Because this is the thing that's going to take us into the future. Alright? The future's looking dark, but we got each other. And I got to make some other thank yous. I got to shout some thank yous out because I was distracted, because this is the first Peterfest not occurring at my apartment. I had to, you know, there's some adjustments. People had to help me out. Some people who helped me out include Mufasa, former introductory speaker. He was the guy who was going to tell you all if I got arrested. I got my dumbass hospitalized, you know, that Peterfest was going to be postponed. I got to thank my man Mike Mocker. If you come out, if you look at my Facebook, Mike Mocker, it's in some of my earliest Facebook pictures, my oral comps, because I went to a weird school that made you do oral exams for your undergrad, and that's weird, and nobody appreciated how weird it was at the time. I did okay at them. I'm okay at that kind of thing.
Love you, bro.
Also got a shout out to a man who's not going to make it here. Greg Garmel, some of you know him. Good comrade, powerful comrade. Helped deliver the booze that you're all enjoying tonight.
Cake.
We also got, saving the best for last, we have the lady of the house, the abbess of Redwall, the woman who has been to Peterfest before. They said, I'll have that at my house. Kit Callie, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Kit.
I was also an introductory speaker one year.
That's right. Kit was also an introductory speaker.
The first
Sorry.
and only one to break the glass ceiling of Peterfest.
Okay, well, sometime we'll have another. I am who I am. And of course, the traditional thank you to the Peterfest attendees. Obviously, this would just be some asshole talking into a camera. It don't work for you all. I love you all, even if I don't know you well. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you're here to celebrate with me and with us. Because this isn't about me, this is about us. All right?
Yeah.
Like obviously, it's also kind of about me. But it's also about us. I think that's good for thank yous right now. This lecture is entitled Alternate History, at the End of History and Beyond. When I was maybe 12 or so, oh yeah, and structure, there's going to be Q&A after. If you got to shout something out, shout it out. Try not to fuck up the flow too bad. When I was maybe 12 or so, my dad got in maybe his last real zinger on me. And what's more, I'm pretty sure he didn't mean to. After seeing a certain display at Walden Books, I asked my dad if he knew anything about alternate history. He looked at me a little puzzled and asked, "You mean like Howard Zinn?" No, listener, I did not mean Howard Zinn. I had nothing in mind that pointed to me being a good, virtuous little leftist or particularly interested in learning anything useful. When I said alternate history, I meant novels set in worlds generated by asking historical what-if questions. I'm not going to dwell too much on definitional issues. Arguably, every novel set on Earth in the past or present is an alternate history novel, given that they all posit something happened that did not actually happen, yada yada yada. I simply say that for the purposes of this lecture, I define alternate history fiction as fiction where a historical counterfactual is a major part of what sells the book to audiences. The usual punt to the power of marketing to define literary categories that critics under late capitalism so often make, but there it is. And it was marketing that drove me to ask my dad about alternate history that day, namely a display of alternate history novels by writers like Harry Turtledove, S.M. Sterling, Stephen Barnes, and other stalwarts of the subgenre. Alternate history fiction in the form we know today came when the form jumped the track from a plaything for historians from Titus Livy to Winston Churchill into the emerging genre of science fiction. This was in large part due to various conceits that became common in alternate history stories and that are still present today. Time travel, dimension shifting, various divergences in the history of technology and science, and technological leaps and that kind of thing. You can take that over from Zach if you want that. We got more friends. We got more friends. That's awesome. It's okay for people in or late. I'm not calling you out to shame you. I'm just saying hi. But the identification of alternate history and sci-fi was so complete by the time I was paying attention in the late 1990s that alternate history stories without such conceits where there's no time travel or magic or advanced technology, were still usually considered sci-fi and shelved as such in bookstores and libraries, unless they were written by established literary figures, such as Philip Roth or Michael Chabon, to name two that dabbled in the subgenre, both of whom are generally considered literary fiction, admittedly with some genre flavor, even when they're doing alternate history. Widely admired works of alternate history fiction, including L. Sprague de Camp's Lest Darkness Fall, Ward Moore's Bring the Jubilee, and Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, dot the sci-fi landscape throughout the 20th century. But something changed in the late 1980s, and this change gathered strength in the 90s and ran into the early aughts. Alternate history became a mainstay of science fiction. Many authors dabbled in it, but a few became dedicated writers of alternate history science fiction, writing little else and often cranking out multiple such novels a year. Literary fiction got in on the act too, as with aforementioned works by Roth and Chabon. So did TV, in the form of the show Sliders, which began as a show, yes, about a group of people forced to travel to a series of alternate dimensions with different histories, but eventually just became a Monster of the Week show.
There was a giant beetle.
There was a giant beetle, it was an Egyptian god.
Women with mustaches.
There's women with mustaches.
Cats and dogs.
Okay, that's enough. No less a figure than Academy Award-winning actor Richard Dreyfuss co-wrote a novel about an America where the American Revolution didn't happen, with Harry Turtledove, which they published in 1995. They were going to make a movie, but it didn't get anywhere. Newt Gingrich slapped his name on some co-written alternate history novels between 1995 and 2011. Hack historian Neil Ferguson put out a book of cultural histories in 1997. A cheap cash-in that tried and failed to take shots at leftist history, mostly on the basis of the great left-wing social historian E.P. Thompson having called counterfactuals, quote, ahistorical shit. There were also a fair few groups at the time dedicated to figuring out alternate histories, Usenet groups, web rings, and the like. Also, I usually say this at the beginning of lectures. If anybody needs a chair and hasn't got one, if they're pregnant, if they've got health issues, please let me know, and I will pick a healthy person out. Just do it. Don't hesitate. Just fucking do it. Okay. Sorry, these Caprinas are strong. Okay. Wow, they're strong. Okay. This moment in the sun for alternate history fiction coincides with two relevant stretches of time. One is my childhood, as well as the portion of that childhood spent reading a lot of alternate history fiction, roughly ages 12 to 18, when I gobbled down works by Harry Turtledove, S.M. Sterling, Eric Flint, and others. I bothered my friends talking about them, though my friends Miri and Phoebe were sweet enough to take me to see Harry Turtledove speak at a local sci-fi convention, Aresia Con, if any of you are familiar with that. Attempted to write stories in the subgenre myself, and made one of my best friends in college when we both gingerly admitted, with the shame that 19 can have for 17, our respective alternate history reading phases to each other. Freshman year dorm, Howland dorm. The alternate history moment also coincides with the era we now sometimes ironically call the end of history. This is named after one of the great whoppers of bad historical prediction. One so bad you have to figure someone could write a decent alternate history story based on the idea, what if Fukuyama was right? Francis Fukuyama was a neoconservative intellectual who wrote the essay The End of History in 1989, where he argued that with the impending collapse of the Soviet Union, and with it the dream of communism history, capital H history in the Hegelian sense, as in conflict over what ideology should guide politics and society, was over, and that liberal democracy, American style, had won the day. This was turned into a book in 1992 and became that rara avis, the Hegelian bestseller. You could call the end of history era the period where serious people could buy what Fukuyama was selling. Ironically, Fukuyama himself, one of the more thoughtful of the neocons, was less bullish about the concept than many others. But for plenty of thought leaders at the time, the world was destined to look more and more like America in the 90s as time went on. Also, I'm sorry if I don't see people like coming in and wave at them, but I wave at you if you are coming. When did this era end? Some would say 2001 with the 9/11 attacks. While I see the point, I think in many ways the reaction to 9/11 was guided by the sort of people who believed the end of history thesis and that Islamic fundamentalists were just backwash to be mopped up. Many of these people being Fukuyama's fellow neocons. 2008 with the financial crash and the resurgence of white revanchism that reared its head with Obama's election is my general stopping point for the end of history period. The late 1980s were also when figures like Harry Turtledove and S.M. Sterling began writing alternate history stories. Arguably the best alternate history novel of that period, Terry Bisson's Fire on the Mountain, came out in 1988. On the other end of the end of history, the break is less clean, but Harry Turtledove concluded his 11-book series that begins with the Confederacy winning the U.S. Civil War with one last novel in 2008. By the way, there's a little handout that I handed out, and it's got some of these names on them and some of the definitions and stuff. If you don't have a handout, like look over the shoulder of someone who does. Okay, cool. The major figures of 90s alternate history continue to publish in the subfield, and new writers take up the concept as well. But I think things shifted somewhat as the 21st century wore on. I guess now is as good a time as any for a thesis, isn't it? I put it to you that the high point of genre prominence for alternate history occurred when it did, due to a concatenation of circumstances that we can see as characteristic of the end of history era. This is not simply a matter of cultural or ideological critique, though that enters into it as well, but it's also a question of material conditions pertaining to the production and consumption of popular art. As these conditions shifted in the post-2008 period, so too did the place of alternate history fiction. Zach, I'm sorry, if you can keep an eye on the stream and see if somebody with a very unusual name texts me, let me know, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. I guess now is there's things. The caveat here around the question of high points. I would not say that the alternate history fiction produced during the end of history era is the best alternate history fiction out there. The products of the subgenre from that era range in quality from quite good, like Bisson's Fire on the Mountain, to absolute dreck, like Neil Ferguson's work and much of Sliders. In general, I'd say they tend to the formulaic and the lower end of mediocre. This was, above all, the era of serieses, or perhaps the beginning of the era of serieses, as exemplified by the works of Harry Turtledove, who at various points in the 20 years we can call the end of history, worked on no fewer than 8 serieses that can be called alternate history, all of them at least 3 books long, alongside multiple standalone alternate history novels. Other major alternate history writers followed suit, and some of these series, like Eric Flint's Ring of Fire series, which began in 2000, are still being written. These series tended to have concepts that did most of the work for them, with action, world building, and characterization varying in quality, but generally being a little pro forma. Whatever their quality, these blockbuster series, many of them bestsellers that hooked a lot of readers, including me when I was a teenager, helped fill out the sorts of chain bookstore displays that first notified me of the genre. This would have been difficult to do with, say, alternate history fiction in the early 1960s, when works like The Man in the High Castle, miles better than any Turtledove potboiler, came out, but weren't understood as representing a discrete subgenre for marketing purposes. I argue that things changed in alternate history fiction after 2008 or so, but of course, most stories of historical rupture carry with them elements of a story of historical continuity and vice versa. There's continuity in the story of alternate history fiction across the 2008 barrier, but there's rupture too. Let's see if we can't parlay continuity into rupture in both the alternate history sphere and the larger historical context. One continuity between our post-2008 period and the end of history era, in which so many of us were born and raised, has been the steady progress of a few economic trends. Rising wealth and income inequality, stagnating wages, and increasingly precarious job security, the delinking of productivity gains from wage growth, and increases in standard of living, the consolidation of wealth in fewer and fewer hands and of corporate power in ever smaller number of conglomerates. This sadly familiar tale has a bearing on our story in a few ways, and continuity and rupture across the 2008 line do-see-do with each other in both the realms of alternate history fiction and of the broader political and cultural context. The speculative fiction industry, like the culture industry more broadly, has seen a bifurcation. Big-name writers make big money, usually with big tentpole series that compete to become movies and TV shows, while millions of others, less fortunate scribblers, find other outlets for their work than conventional publishing, especially self-publishing, now enabled by Amazon to sell directly to consumers and fan fiction. This dynamic was somewhat less pronounced at the beginning of the end of history era in the late 80s and early 90s than it is today. You could argue that a lot of the alternate history writers at the time existed as sort of broad middle class of speculative fiction writers, the sorts of people who read and wrote for the pulps back when they were still relevant and cut their teeth on the expanding paperback market of the mid to late 20th century. But we all know what happens to middle classes when the top decides to rake back their wealth and power, and there's no meaningful opposition to stop them. Arguably, the creators of big alternate history series during the end of history era, Turtledove, Sterling, Flint, made it past that big thresher into the lower strata of the series-producing sci-fi gentry, though they're small fry compared to your J.K. Rowlings and George R.R. Martins. Inequality and a general feeling of stagnation or decline also spurs discontent. This is true in the literary realm as it is in the political realm, though the linkage between discontent and action can get blurry. In the political world, it gets downright warped in the world of culture. And altogether too neat analog of so many political situations in the world over since 2008, the speculative fiction community, in the Anglosphere anyway, has grown its very own red-blue divide. It maps neatly onto the red-blue divide in mainstream American politics, which spreads like a weird mimetic virus to other political contexts the world over, complete with a febrile, fascist-adjacent red team and a smug, complacent blue team, and masses of people and many pressing questions left out of the equation. This manifests itself most dramatically in the Puppygate saga, where various coalitions of right-leaning sci-fi and fantasy writers, ranging from libertarian, contrarian cranks to out-and-out Nazis, tried to hijack the Hugo Awards nomination process, one of the big award ceremonies in the speculative fiction community, or else burn the awards' credibility to the ground. The different puppy factions, you see, they're ironic, which means they can't actually be terrible pieces of shit, right? Did this out of spite for what they saw as a liberal elite of writers and editors imposing social message fiction on a mass of readers who just wanted spaceships and lasers. Unlike certain other encounters in the 2013 to 2017 period, in which the Puppygate fiasco took place, the blue team won decisively. N.K. Jemisin, author of the Broken Earth novels and Target, with much abuse from the puppies as a social justice warrior and a black woman, won 3 Hugos for Best Novel in a row. For now, it seems that the red and blue camps in contemporary sci-fi are here to stay, sniping at each other online and conforming more and more to type. The conservative gobbler up of identikit military sci-fi stories of buff guys in power armor shooting aliens, the liberal mark for any story pitch with an oppressed narrator and a few buzzwords, as mutually antagonistic believer communities so often do. It's not strictly symmetrical. It's not a matter of both sides. The red side, led by the puppy factions, really did harass and tried to disrupt the other side in ways that the blues didn't do back to them. If you want your sci-fi to jump the track to mainstream respectability, it does help to have the literary ambition, social relevance, and better editing, often less cringeworthy cover art, of blue favorites like Jemisin and Lecky and so on. Though that doesn't always translate to superior sales numbers, as any number of pulpy populist stalwarts like Jim Butcher or David Weber can attest to. Alternate history fiction enters into this dynamic mostly on the margins. One of the bigger social media brawlers in the notoriously rough playground that is young adult fiction social media, Justina Ireland, started a YA alternate history sci-fi series about slavery and zombies, and she doesn't hesitate to wade into speculative fiction fights on the blue side. Her day job, by the way, is a defense logistics professional for a Navy contractor.
Navy.
But most of the big players in high-stakes speculative fiction drama aren't mainly known as alternate history writers. As I will discuss later in the lecture, I don't think it's accurate to say that alternate history has gone into eclipse since the end of history period, but its place in the genre and the culture at large has changed. This is where the long-suffering listener might be thinking that we're finally going to get into the ideology critique, how alternate history fiction has changed with the changes in prevailing ideology between the late 80s and today. Of course, you all know I'm a materialist, so I throw in stuff about material conditions, even Ed said it. And we've read enough left book-inspired articles to know that now's the time where I lie the ideology bare. Well, far be it from me to disappoint my guests. I'm going to play with it a little. I think changes in ideological bent, the values expressed that map more or less neatly onto contemporary set-piece political battles are only one strand in the braid of ruptures and continuities that run not just between contemporary alternate history fiction and that of yesteryear, but between any set of coordinates in cultural past and present. In short, I'll give you your ideological meat, but also your historiographical veggies. Whether you like it or not. It won't surprise anyone to learn that the main ideological differences between alternate history of its peak period in the 90s and aughts and alternate history today is found in the treatment of race and gender. It would probably be pretty easy and even true enough to say that earlier alternate history had problematic takes on those subjects, and contemporary alternate history is more woke. Consider some of the plots of big-time alternate history works from the 90s and aughts. Harry Turtledove's The Guns of the South, where Afrikaner militants use a time machine to give General Lee's armies AK-47s. The same author's Southern Victory series depicting a different victorious Confederacy sans time travel this time. Stephen Barnes wrote a series about Africans enslaving white people to work in the Americas. And there's my personal favorite, the Draka series by S.M. Sterling, where American loyalists fleeing the revolution go to South Africa and eventually create a slave super-state that comes to conquer the world. Then consider the premises of recent alternate history hits. Downtrodden 19th century nations use magic and steampunk to turn the tables on the imperialists in P. Jelly Clark's work. The ANC and apartheid South African secret police fight over an empathy machine. Wandering circus folk disrupt a world run by Luddites. Dinosaur riding Sioux Native Americans do dances with wolves, but with dinosaurs instead of horses. With Colonel Custer's son, it's a whole new world. Maybe, but there's complications. Let's look closer. I've seen people cite the basic premises of these books, especially the older alternate history novels I just cited, as prima facie evidence of the writer's racism and reactionary sentiments, or lack thereof, in the case of more liberal-leaning recent volumes. I think it's worth getting deeper in there and exploring what exactly the writers thought they were doing with race, gender, and politics more generally. Let's start with the material within it. The big alternate history writers of the end of history era were all working sci-fi writers who made a living by cranking out a lot of writing. Often multiple novels a year, usually in multiple subgenres of speculative fiction, and often as sidelines, writing for TV or movies, or for the tie-in novels attached to them. So for instance, Terry Bisson, who wrote the excellent Fire on the Mountain, also wrote the novelizations of Johnny Mnemonic, The Fifth Element, and Galaxy Quest.
It's a good movie!
I object.
The best Star Trek movie.
Many of these writers continued that work rate well into the second and third decades of the 21st century. What this means for us is that along with whatever points they were trying to make with their fiction, they primarily write to entertain. This doesn't obviate the messages within their work, but it's relevant to reading them that these writers need to crank out a lot of prose, needed to appeal to an audience, and needed ways to vary things up to keep the formulas fresh. The model I developed when revisiting or visiting these works for the first time is less that any given writer had a line, a defined take on race or sexuality or power or what have you, but a space, a range of ideas they considered sufficiently credible or interesting or just relevant to put in their fiction. So the same guy, S.M. Sterling, who wrote about the white South African slave superstate, also wrote a series about a black lesbian sea commander who uses her samurai swords to fight slavers after Nantucket in the 1990s gets zapped to the Bronze Age somehow. It's complicated. The guy who wrote the Africans Enslaving European series was black himself and wrote about different kinds of slavery and their relative attributes, etc. Harry Turtledove wrote of a kindly Robert E. Lee using his AK-47s to create a gently progressive Confederacy in the guns of the South, but ended his Southern Victory series by lazily mapping the story of Nazi Germany onto that of the Confederacy, with black people filling in for the Jews. Let's put it this way. In the mainstream of end-of-history era alternate history fiction, you will find no careers that argue straightforwardly and schematically, the way we like it to be on the internet, for white supremacy, slavery, misogyny, fascism, etc. So what then is the space of thought in alternate history of this period? What's there and what's not? Well, let's get the obvious for this crowd out of the way. Communism, right now. Communism means Stalin, as far as Turtledove and Sterling are concerned, and moreover means weak competitors with liberal democracy and a lame villain next to fascism. No one but fanatical idiots believes it in their stories, and they're outnumbered by devious secret policemen and ideologues playing the system. The Draka, the South African master race Sterling devised, practice a weird sort of slave-driven corporatism, and it's clear Sterling can more easily imagine that than an end to capitalism. And that seems to be the main line for alternate history at the time. There's exceptions. Terry Bisson's cooperativist New Africa, founded by John Brown's breaking of slave power and Fire on the Mountain, but that was exactly the kind of work that your old sci-fi heads nod approvingly at and never reproduce. Eric Flint, author of the 1632 and 1812 series, was a Trotskyite, but is clearly one of those dudes who working classed himself into thinking that working class revolution is bullshit because the guys in pickup trucks don't talk about it. Eric Flint's good societies are vaguely social democratic, but revolution to him is getting rid of inquisitors in 17th century Germany, which is a good first step, I guarantee. And teaming up with the less progressive king, with the most progressive king around, which would mean, in this case, if anyone's keeping score, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, and no shit, Oliver Cromwell. It's less that these writers were anti-communist, and more that their visions were orthogonal, seeing any kind of communist or visionary horizon. The radical left option is out of the box and end-of-history sci-fi. The radical right option is not. Genocide, slavery, and the redemption of various right-wing monsters loom... Oh, sorry, lost track. Loom all throughout end-of-history alternate history. The redemptive angle is especially worth considering, and here, aspects of vernacular historical thought inherited both from the culture at large and from speculative fiction tradition mesh with timely ideas and concerns during some old themes and new clothes. Harry Turtledove premises all of his work involving the Confederacy on the acceptance of many tropes of lost cause historiography. Robert E. Lee is a kindly man who didn't like slavery, the importance of states' rights over and above the slavery question, the idea that the Confederacy could ever have been a normal functioning country, let alone a superpower, all dubious. The Germans especially eventually joined Team Earth to fight off aliens when they invade during World War II, and another one of Turtledove's endless series is, because as everyone knows, the German army was essentially smart and honorable, unlike that nasty Hitler fellow.
True that.
The good dictator, the ambivalent slaver, the reluctant mass killer, made to be what they are by circumstances, and their realistic acceptance of same, their humanity wrung for pathos on the rack, of their fun-to-read misdeeds. We see these in a lot of science fiction and fantasy going back to the genre's origins. And the old alternate history guys were thoroughgoing readers of the old sci-fi and fantasy guys, as we know. If anyone has ice, please put it in the ice bucket over there. You can interrupt and make noise while I'm reading. I'm loud. It's cool. Thank you.
Just pass it, like fire brigade.
Oh yeah, you can fire brigade.
Is this a part of the lecture?
Yes.
Let's be on these two.
Effectively.
This is socialism in action.
Thanks for the ice, guys. We seriously needed ice really, really bad. Thank you so much. Not that kind of ice, that's right.
Hey, yeah, that kind.
Okay, back to the lecture. Bubbles, ironies, paradoxes, and the self-congratulatory consideration that we made up out of bubbles, ironies, and paradoxes constitute many of the coordinate points defining the space of alternate history fiction at the end of history. To the extent there is a hook to these books other than curiosity about the what-if premise and whatever action they boast, it is precisely the made-you-think moment you're supposed to have when you consider that perhaps the AK-wielding Confederate or the novel-writing slaver soldier isn't so different from you after all. Another way in which Fire on the Mountain is exceptional. He doesn't really do that. You can change the set dressing, move borders around on the big wrist board, occasionally have more or less political freedom, but the basic structures, capitalism, our concepts of race, sex, gender, and so on, something like the nation state, do their structuring thing, provide scaffolding for the usual human dilemmas of middling writers. War and peace, love and sex, career ambition, inability to control complex situations, and so on. These dilemmas, in their turn, provide filling in between depictions of battles and little historical cameo moments for the fans that make up most of the appeal to most readers of end-of-history alternate history. I think I'm done with this, Katerina. In many ways, the space of fiction maps onto the general space of politics that the philosophers of the end of history provided, which is also sometimes considered the era of there is no alternative. What we had and the mental armatures that come with it is what we have, and it's not going to change. History in this vision becomes a set of dusty museum pieces to be mulled over. If anything, the difference between the alternate history space and what someone like Francis Fukuyama thought about things is that Fukuyama would have understood that in the past, people really did think differently, not just in their opinions about issues, but in their patterns of thought and their concepts, in a way that writers at the time or now only seem to have fitfully understood. Different thinking means a modern person can rook an ancient person at strategy if they get zapped back to the past in a lot of these books, because ancient people are supposedly mentally inflexible. That's a level of sophistication at which they generally work. Allow me to fill in the space we've created for end of history, alternate history fiction a little before we turn to what changed as the 21st century wore on. I see there's being basically two engines for the alternate history mobile as it chugs along, picking up readers on its tour for what it thinks as the Garden of Forking Paths, but is actually more like a carousel or Disney theme ride. The first is Harry Turtledove, of course. Like a certain kind of car, you know what you're getting when you pick up a Turtledove novel. You get high-concept what-ifs that you can usually be described in one sentence, like, what if the Confederacy had AK-47s? You usually get some war. You'll get a few awkward heterosexual sex scenes each book. Ask in private for me to describe some if you want. You'll get disasters, but little really changes, except for some borders and who's alive and who's dead. The second engine of end of history, alternate history, consists of online alternate history fans who wrote their own series. These were often better written and more historically rigorous than published alternate history fiction. They often took the form of hybrid works, combining omniscient history book style analysis with narration from fictional viewpoint characters. They often pushed the envelope too with the historical concepts more than your Turtledove types did. In the end, though, a lot of the successful series on a lot of these sort of web groups can be read as parables of how badly wrong things could have gone had anyone messed with the history that resulted in the triumph of liberal democracy circa 1990. An Australian I corresponded with wrote a series called Decades of Darkness, which situation is brought on by New England seceding from the Union during the War of 1812 and allowing the rest of America to become, what else, a slave superstate. The serial, often considered the crown of the genre on these online groups, starts with FDR dying, relative progressive Vice President Henry Wallace becoming president, and a series of disasters occurring, which accumulates in nuclear war, mass cannibalism, and Jim Jones becoming U.S. president 30 years later. There's some outliers that deserve talking about too, who did things a little differently, but still belong firmly in the literary space we're talking about. One is familiar from a lot of our adolescent readings, Orson Scott Card. Card was big stuff in the 90s, coming off the success of Ender's Game. In 1987, he began the Alvin Maker series, which are a series of fantasy novels set in a version of early 19th century America, where the various magical traditions of its inhabitants work. The first two books in the series are actually pretty good, and it's a compelling concept. The reason I bring the series up here is that both point to a historical apotheosis outside of the end of history concept while remaining well inside their idea space. The answer to the riddle of how that can be is Mormonism. Any non-Mormon reader of the Alvin Maker series knows the sinking feeling of reading that series, getting into the later books, and before the action gets stupid as Card becomes a worse writer, it turns into obvious Mormon propaganda. Alvin Maker is going to fix everything, the broken promise of America, by incorporating all of the magical traditions of the continent's inhabitants, white, black, and red, into his anti-entropy super magic and start up a golden city in the West. Hold on, pages, problems, hold on. And then there's S.N. Sterling, with his aforementioned oscillation between slave empires and not slave empires. Among other things, Sterling was a participant in online sci-fi discussion groups for a long time. He was notorious in getting in flame wars that led to him being banned from forum after forum. He seems to have calmed down some in recent years. He has a Twitter, but he doesn't use that. This is part of how we know that genocide and slavery aren't just fantasies for him. He would make on these arguments big Heinlein-esque declarations about how genocide solved many problems, Muslims as a whole were the enemy, blah, blah. From what I know of his biography, he's a classic child of late empires. He's got an Anglo-Canadian dad. No one loved the British Empire more than nerdy men from the white settler dominions, and a French mom. So it makes sense why the romance of settler empire, and you see it again and again in his work, not just with the slave empire of the Draka, would appeal so strongly. The reason I talk about Sterling here isn't to own him for being a reactionary. For one thing, he would try to wriggle out of that by pointing out the liberal hero, by pointing to his liberal heroes and his reactionary villains. It's true that the Draka get into a Cold War with the USA, where he frantically signals that the US are the good guys. Spoilers, the Draka still win because they're tough. It's also true that his time-stranded Nantucketers go around the Bronze Age world freeing slaves. Sterling doesn't seem to see these actors as... Sterling seems to see these actors as heroes doing heroic things, but also allows that slavers, Nazis, and genocidaires could be heroes too, because heroism is ultimately defined by strength. Beyond the politics, I think, to put it bluntly, Sterling gets off on slavery. His slave empires, the Draka and the others, have a lot of sex that Sterling would probably think of as kinky, but which any millennial or later Zoomer would instantly ID as fairly standard misogynistic, slavery-based, non-consensual S&M between men and women or between women and women. Among the Draka, for instance, Draka men routinely rape slave women, but Draka women, who are liberated in many ways, never seem to get it on with slave men. Sterling seems to know where to draw the line, and that's where he stops being horny. At times, Sterling has his good liberal heroes denounce the lack of consent as a concept among the Draka or the bad guys in the Change universe or whatever. One is even tempted to believe that Sterling believes it, with his brain if not his libido. But it's also clear that he loves the Draka, and loves the settler badasses more generally. They're always tough, they're always smart, they're always sexy. Most of them see the problems with their system, but philosophize them away, often with reference to their responsibility to keep things from getting worse. And we're supposed to believe that this constitutes character. The process of settlement, of conquering a territory and settling it with your people, that in Sterling stories is what gives life meaning. It provides opportunities for mastery. It allows for the good life. The liberals in Sterling's stories often lament the pointlessness of their societies, or else find a settlement substitute, like space exploration. Sterling's good settlers and slavers are usually from classy old money, and the bad ones are tacky new money, bureaucrats, gangsters, etc. The slaves in these stories have mostly resigned themselves to their lot, and are often quite frisky, sexually speaking. You can almost appreciate the lengths to which Sterling goes to make every instance of upsetting a slave or settler apple cart into a hideous, pointless atrocity, really upping the pathos if you have a strong stomach. Here we see the prevalent patterns of thought in the end of history era. Rebellion as tragedy coincide with good old-fashioned sexual pathology. This is a good time to Google image search letter S, letter M, Sterling with an I, if you want to have a funny little stinger to this whole discussion. As it happens, I could stomach Sterling as a teen. I didn't read the Draka books, they weren't at Borders, and what I knew of them from the forums made me leery, but I loved and often pestered my friends about the Change series, the one with Nantucket being zapped to the Bronze Age. And as it happens, I could stomach them as an adult too, though that's partially because of my training as a scholar of the right and a scholar of genre fiction. Sterling is a pretty decent action writer, and writing good battles and fights, that's not as easy as it sounds. The sheer verve and gusto of his world-building concepts, and the way he wears his weirdness on his sleeve, even as he thinks he's completely normal, can't help but stir my admiration. The first Draka novel in particular is pretty good, because it gets into a genuinely alien headspace, and has good battle action, and critically, it's only 200 pages. What poisons Sterling work isn't being a reactionary crackpot. You can be a good writer and be a reactionary. It's bloat and sentimentality. As he got more successful, he asked fewer interesting questions, wrote much longer books with a shit ton of filler, repeated himself, and perhaps in response to the internet interlocutors that we know he got in flame wars with, softened a lot of the edges of his heroes and made his bad guys more capitally evil, both in the hammy Disney-style ways. I messed up that sentence. Anyway, it's bad. If anyone wants to open up that whiskey, we're all about that whiskey. There's whiskey over there. It's not open. So, it appears to us we have a reasonably fleshed out ecosystem of alternate history writing circa the end of history. What happens when history returns around our admittedly somewhat arbitrary milepost of 2008? Let's once again get the relatively obvious internet-style ideology critique out of the way first. There is indeed a good amount of back and forth pertaining to capital H history and the mode of ideological conflict in contemporary alternate history fiction. Things like slavery and genocide are treated not as just unfortunate aspects of the human condition in these later books, but as a product of power relationships that deserve to be critiqued and overturned. Many contemporary writers put a good deal of attention into matters of representation, what sort of characters they have doing what. I actually don't see that as a complete break from earlier eras. If nothing else, your old sci-fi guys, including some of these alternate history guys, knew that putting objectionable ideas and actions onto characters from put-upon groups helped them get over. But there's a different sort of focus on it now. Sometimes it drives more serious attention to character, sometimes it's tokenism, but I will say the character representation question does seem to eclipse other ways that writers could use to interrogate difficult subjects and create interesting perspectives. Let's say we can't elevate ourselves beyond the cultural war set pieces by going through them, like striking through a target. You want to punch someone in the nose? Think you're punching them 3 inches in the back of their head. In the ideological conflicts that have roiled the speculative fiction scene in the last 10 years or so, the reactionary side accuses the liberal side of neglecting entertainment in favor of political sermonizing, mostly about identity. This is bullshit. Liberal sci-fi favorites like Nora Jemisin, Anne Leckie, Yoon-Ha Lee, and the rest pack their stories with all the space battles and twisty betrayals you could ever want. Reactionary and liberal sci-fi both seem to borrow from the same basic sources these days. video games, anime, role-playing games, comic books, and major crossover hits like Harry Potter and Game of Thrones. It's clear that what the puppies and other reactionary fans object to is their inability to project onto heroes who might be women or queer or people of color. What does it mean when the argument over the nature of speculative fiction, which is meant to be an exploration of human and even beyond human possibilities, so often becomes a question of projection? That is to say, one of the more common modes that viewers use to criticize online pornography. They say they don't like this actor because they can't project onto him. They say they don't like this actress because of X, Y, or Z flaw that they can only care about in their particular viewing situation. They can't imagine themselves the captain of this particular spaceship engaging in this particular mission. It's all the same shit. Porn, sci-fi, whatever. Let's use the sort of internet pronunciamento about the current age that I don't usually like, just as a pry bar to help us understand. The idea of the death of context. It's not really dead context. Plenty of people get context. But it's true enough in the case of projection complainers, either in sci-fi, fantasy, or in pornography. Why should they need any context for their decisions when they're just looking to jerk off? To whom must they explain themselves? Ironically, as the eye of the surveillance machine of which the internet makes up a large part steadies its gaze on us, many of us imagine ourselves alone to satisfy our consumer preferences, isolated from all other considerations. It seems clear that more and more of us are incapable of understanding choice in any other way. I see this as a mode of consciousness. I see this mode of consciousness as a product of the conjuncture between the maturation of consumer economics in the late 20th century and the concomitant collapse of shared public narratives of how life, politics, society, and much else functions as the Cold War wound down and finally ended. In short, the discursive mode that seeded much of the ideological turmoil and speculative fiction, and I'd argue that is currently eating the concept of criticism alive, gathered much of its strands together in the end of history era. So it's all a continuity, right? Joined together by superficial readings, mediocrity, context collapse, so on. Well, a graph is a continuity. It starts at one place and continues on to another. At what point in the graph is the change that it depicts significant enough to become a rupture? That's the kind of question that bothers a certain kind of historian. It bothers me too, I won't dwell on it. Spend enough time thinking seriously about history, and you'll get used to seeing continuity and rupture together, creating continuities and ruptures out of their opposite numbers. But here's a rupture for you. Intellectual and cultural historians identify the end of the 20th century with the collapse of consensus narratives that dominated public life in America and many other societies in the early and mid-20th centuries. A lot of these histories are pretty good, but they tend to be two-panel comics, if you're familiar with comics. First, yes, people are familiar with comics. Panel 1, Americans by and large agree on a broad consensus around what you could call moderate nationalism, anti-communist, liberal democracy. Did I really put the word liberalist there? That's not a word. Sorry, everybody. Gradual progress in terms of equality of opportunity and so on. Panel 2. People know believe. Or if they do, they mean completely different things when they talk about these concepts. But it doesn't make sense that it would happen just like that. Rupture in continuity. Science fiction and fantasy in the 20th century has been a site for the exploration of unusual and uncommon ideas, including being a place where seeds of extremist ideologies, understood in mid-centuries un-American, mostly on the far right, could estivate, waiting for a better climate. But there is continuity. In many respects, science fiction held to the idea of a common core of truth, generally identified with science, its progress, and the social progress that is meant, mutatis mutandis, to go along with scientific progress, longer than it was necessarily fashionable in more literary publishing circles. Moreover, it seems pretty likely that Francis Fukuyama, when he wrote The End of History, thought he was ushering in a new consensus to replace the mid-century consensus, at least among elites. He didn't think he was heralding an era of the collapse of consensus, the collapse of context. Let's get back to alternate history. With the inevitable exception of Terry Bisson, who was an old SDS and anti-fascist hand, it's worth noting, the major alternate history producers of the end of history era, even if they didn't buy or even know about what Fukuyama proclaimed, all in all, in their way, pay tribute to the last thing that could pose as a consensus picture of history. The progress and triumph of liberal democracy, capitalism, and Western science and technology, even as they honor it in the breach by creating alternate history scenarios where everything goes the other way. Even Fukuyama thought the end of history would prove tiresome, especially for people who like war, which many sci-fi nerds do. The consensus picture of history is a negative against which the alternate history scenarios of the end of history period could be read. I don't think it's a total coincidence that this was also the height of the subgenre's visibility. A rupture within a continuity. Many of the big names of alternate history fiction from the end of history era are still plugging away in the genre. Eric Flint turns out stories of his West Virginia mining town democratizing Europe after getting zapped back to the 30 Years' War. S.M. Sterling has a series about Teddy Roosevelt winning the presidency in 1912 and starting up the CIA, but cooler. Harry Turtledove, who really has seemed to have given up, wrote a story about Stalin being raised in the U.S., but still doing all the Stalin stuff as U.S. president, despite his life being completely different but from babyhood. Where do these guys figure in the ideological conflict that has roiled sci-fi fantasy in the last 10 years? You'd figure they'd be involved, especially given that Sterling loves a fucking flame war. The answer, almost nowhere. Sterling used to try to start fights with left-leaning writers early in the period, but seems to have settled down of late. Occasionally, given what the Draka series looks like, left-leaning writers use Sterling's work as an example of what reactionary sci-fi looks like, but Sterling's a third stringer in that respect, next to gaudy assholes like Ted, Vox Day, Beale. Some commenters use Eric Flynn's allegiance to the publisher Bain, which publishes a lot of the major reactionary military sci-fi writers, as proof that Bain is beyond ideology, given Flynn's background as a Trotskyite organizer. Turtledove's really nowhere to be found in this shit, as far as I could Google. I tried to find commentary among the Puppygate types on alternate history. It doesn't seem to be something they've really thought about. And if they're not thinking about it, then they're opposite numbers. The speculative fiction liberals, they really aren't thinking about it either, even as some produce alternate history fiction themselves. The alternate history greats of the end of history era, such as they are now like so many of our legacy cultural institutions. They seem to go mostly on inertia. A lot of people. What does alternate history mean in a situation when there really isn't a consensus idea of what happened in actual history? You could argue that many of our fellow citizens are essentially living in alternate history fiction scenarios already. Here I draw a distinction between people living within accurate ideas of the past in their head, that's a lot of people, and people collaboratively recreating history according to standards that the participants may think are those of actual history, but are actually many of the same standards that go into creating genre fiction. Entertainment value, emotional satisfaction, potential for viral spread. What does that sound like? Sounds like QAnon. We've also seen the collapse of genres along with context and consensus history. Alternate history becomes one trope among many and easily mixed with all kinds of others between and across genres. You can index this to the rising prevalence of alternate history fiction that throws fealty to science out altogether. There's always magic or what amounted to magical technology in alternate history fiction. Most of the time before our current era, the magic was restricted to a single moment. Something gets shifted in time. A single advanced technology becomes available and we follow the historical changes, like those time travelers with the AKs for General Lee. Stories where magic and ultra technology exist throughout the story as part of the setting are much more prevalent in alternate history fiction written now. Alternate history writers of the late 20th century were among the first to seize upon the possibilities of alternate dimensions in the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics. is shown by subgenre progenitors H. Piper Beam's Paratime Patrol series, the inevitable alternate dimension cop series by the inevitable Harry Turtledove, and so on. But the many worlds came into their own, not with the schematic stories of the late 20th century, where, with few exceptions, there was a stable reference point, America, circa whenever the piece was being written, but with contemporary sci-fi. Did I do a thing? Yeah, I did a thing. Those of you who think I'm a genre snob, hear me now. Comic book fans and fan fiction people get many worlds. They grok it, to use a term from an old sci-fi line, in ways that the old sci-fi masters generally didn't and still don't. You have to hand it to them. They navigate a world of few stable reference points. Sure, there's canon, but who cares about canon? Your real fan fiction head keeps a great many realities in their minds at once. Lord love them. Horniness, narcissism, obsessive completism, and pedantry have driven your true fan into a mental space that had precursors before the 2008 breach, but really only came into its own after. And they really are pioneers, and I think they deserve respect. Alternate history scenarios, then, become so many branches of the noosphere, the realm of ideas. Nothing separating them from Tolkien's Middle-earth or any other product of the human imagination, from the world of QAnon, for that matter. I suppose if there's a thesis here, it's to say that the late 20th century, arguably the whole second half, was a time of unusually strong divides in the noosphere, that people believed in, and that many of those divisions have since collapsed, leaving us in the situation we're in today. After all, who's to say? Somewhere in the many worlds of ill-understood quantum physics, there isn't a Middle-earth, or a world where JFK Jr. faked his death to battle the deep state.
Yes, he did.
Or the scariest world of all, wherever the fuck the little brave toaster happened. Well, physicists are to say. But who cares what Stephen Hawking might say next to what Rick Sanchez offers our imaginations? In the collapse of consensuses, from the definitions of genre to the understanding of history, we have a freedom that has naturally led to an effervescence in alternate history fiction and in speculative fiction, in art more generally, right? Of course we did. Just like how the internet democratized information, made people smarter and less susceptible to misinformation. To use an expression from the end of history period and from my youth, not! Contemporary alternate history fiction is mostly pretty fucking lousy, much like the alternate history fiction of the late 20th century. Most of it abandons efforts at being historically rigorous, which would be fine, a good thing even, if they did anything especially creative with it, which they generally don't. You wind up with a lot of just-so stories and tedium, at least in part, I think, due to the shadow of young adult fiction and other influences that don't especially encourage critical thought about what a given writer is really doing. Contemporary alternate history fiction tends to be shorter than the honking long series of yore, which is nice, I guess. Home stretch, folks. Here's a suggestion. Maybe instead of adopting a single story or giving the nod to any story that comes down the pipe, we apply our critical capacity. We acknowledge that there's a reality that we live in, that not everything is equally true or untrue, but also that we have imaginations capable of seeing things that aren't there for a reason, to imagine possibilities and impossibilities. Maybe we could try out some old ideas and some new ones as something other than set dressing. The first one that comes to mind is the dialectic. The creation of new ideas. That's right. The creation of new ideas through the opposition of existing ones, like that between our concrete realities and our limitless imaginations. Maybe games are better with rules because everyone can play, and everyone can make new ones. Everyone can make house rules with their friends. And we're going to do some CeeLo later on, so that'll be a thing. Maybe we could try communicating, but first we'd have to come up with something to say. When we do, then we can walk onto the paths of the many worlds as though we belong there. Alright, what time is it, Zach?
8:40.
It'll say, okay, 8:40. Did anybody like text during that time?
Nobody texted.
Alright, I might have been ripped off by a Boston legend. Probably not, maybe, I don't know, it's okay.
Peter, it's I, Jonathan Noble, and
Yes,
I have
John
a
Noble is the
question.
traditional first question.
Wait, I have a first question.
Yeah. You haven't noticed?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well you do.
Okay. All right. My question is, one thing I know about about alternate history fiction is that they tend to engage in a lot of the same assumptions over and over again about how history would have deviated. For example, every single alternate history story I've ever seen where the Germans won the war has them conquering North America. And I don't think that actually makes a whole lot of sense that they would have fought a transatlantic war. And what do you have any opinions about common alternate history conceits that you think are like that?
Yeah, it's stupid and it's dumb. It's as dumb as it's stupid. I've thought about the Nazi win scenario for like gaming purposes. I always assumed that like the Nazis would like have a puppet regime in America if they were gonna have anything. That's fucking stupid. No, it's usually like the shit. There's definitely a relationship with like shitty pop history. Could someone make me like a whiskey and ginger ale with some ice?
A whiskey ginger for the birthday boy.
That's right. It's usually the assumptions of some shitty pop history, which raises some chicken egg questions. Like, why is it that people are like, what if the Confederates had won the Civil War? Versus like other more germane questions, or what if the Nazis invade North America? I think there is. I mean, let's be real. Alternate history is basically history fan fiction, and they usually kind of go with like obvious shit. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And like, there's a whole subgenre of like alternate history about, you know, what if the Nazis had invaded Britain and the British writers, and they're like, oh my goodness, what's an identity crisis? What if we were part of an empire that oppressed everybody? Wouldn't that be crazy?
Hey.
Okay, I can't really see everybody under there, so if you want to ask a question from there, really wave your hand. Sarah. Fuck, it's been a long time since I've seen it. I'm gonna go with the bug.
Yeah. Also, the bug's not Egyptian god. It was genetically engineered to act as a representation.
Okay, cool.
Sacrifice.
Okay, that's kind of similar. Then Sam.
Dr. Berard, in
Sorry,
your
I have a
notes,
dog.
in your notes you posit that global warming is becoming a factor.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Peter. Happy birthday to you.
And many more.
Dr. Berard, more of a question than a comment. You bring up global warming as being one of the shifts out of end of history. What are your thoughts on global warming being an actual end of history and that's impact on alternative histories? For example, World War Z.
Probably fucked. Like, I was actually thinking like I should have like a quick way to kill myself in case shit goes real south real fast.
Same.
Yeah, right. But one of my homies, I'm not gonna say who, one of my homies who lives near me, was like, just join me. I got like tons of like shit. Al, you could be part of my fucking post-apocalypse posse. And I'm like, hell yeah. So I guess there's someone in Watertown who's post-apocalypse posse I can be part of. And I can like do negotiations with the Armenians. Armenians out there. I don't know Armenia, but I've been to some of the protests.
Yeah,
History. Yeah, it's an interesting civilization last 50 years. and they do alternate history like, what if we didn't fuck this up so bad? I kind of stewarded the earth, you know what if we weren't all aqua citizens? Alright, what's the next question? We got Kate, lady of the house.
Okay, so my question is, in theory, it seems like historical fiction and alternate history should be related genres.
Oh, fuck. You fucked up, dude.
But in fact, they don't have a lot of relationship to each other in terms of like the way they're written, who they're written by, their audiences.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I like have never read alternate history because it seems like dorky and lame.
Yeah.
So I was curious if you could comment on the different uses and purposes of historical fiction versus alternate history. A lot of it's just marketing, but I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And also, you defined historical fiction for me once, but I was real drunk, so I don't remember. I think the idea with alternate history fiction is that it gives you like license to do all kinds of shit. It doesn't make any sense. It's fucking stupid. But the problem is historical fiction kind of does that too, because it's like all of a sudden every goddamn rake in Georgian London secretly wants a modest girl from the provinces who's beautiful but doesn't know it yet. He secretly wants to marry her. Alright, like these rakes, like, okay, fucking British boarding school, okay, let's just say that. That's what they really want. But yeah, it's interesting. So historical fiction, like you say, it relies on this idea of verisimilitude. So like George A. Heyer, who I read when I was doing a thing on romance fiction, you could look at the YouTube video if you want, was really well known for like knowing what all the carriages were like in Georgian London, right, in Restoration London, right, knowing what all the houses and interior fucking decor was like, and like didn't give a fuck what like actual society was like. I mean, kinda, but like not really. So it's basically. To a greater or lesser extent, most alternate history fiction is political alternate history fiction, which is to say, to the extent it follows history in a meaningful sense at all, it follows political history, which is to say, the history of politicians, the history of wars and battles and this and that. The idea that history basically flows from the decisions that are made at the time. So any kind of social history, right, history from below, isn't really a thing here. Any kind of like cultural history is not really a thing here. It's all considered dependent upon political history in alternate history fiction. Whereas, actually, interestingly enough, a lot of the historical romance writers and the like, and historical fiction writers, actually do look at cultural history, but in this very narrow sense. They're not interrogating like our concepts. They're interrogating the fucking carriages. They're interrogating the interior decor. They're interrogating the clothes. And honestly, all that shit's cool. Like, all that shit is worth knowing about. I'm not trying to shit on that. But it's like, you gotta try and figure out some context for it. Is that a good answer to your question?
Well, I mean, the historical fiction I read is more like Hilary Mantel and like Hill. So I've never read George A. Heyer.
Okay, I haven't read Hilary. You beat me.
No,
it's your birthday.
No,
Historical fiction that isn't even necessarily romance, like a lot of it is definitely the kind of
No.
like play. It's just like playground.
but I agree that there's like a real focus on like the sensual experience of being in a particular time and place, and also on social and cultural history.
If
And
I
it's also
promise
gender
you I
fluid.
read some Hilary Mantel, would that be good?
She's wonderful.
I bet she is. Great.
Peter Berard, Greg Zapata, first time, long time. You're welcome.
Thank you.
So, now being a layperson as far as historical fiction goes, alternate history, it appears that a lot of historical fiction comes from a conservative attitude. What if the Confederates had won? What if the Nazis had won? What if the White Russians had won? Possibly. But going forward in the genre, climate crisis notwithstanding, what do you foresee being the big pivot points in history that historians will focus on? And do you see these pivot points being inherently conservative or perhaps left-leaning in their attitude? What if Bernie had won? What if Gore had won? What if Bernie had won a second time? I don't know. But where do you see the genre going, and by what political attitude you see it taking, climate crisis notwithstanding?
Cool, thank you, Greg. I'm a fan of the game Chrononauts.
Yes.
And Chrononauts put out an expansion called The Gore Years. Gore had won. They're kind of normal kids, like, love you guys, Lunar Labs, like, all respect, but I actually see there being quite possibly more in the way of like stuff just about like the Soviet Union, like if the Cold War had gone a different way. There was some stuff like that during the end of history era, but really surprisingly little, considering how recent it was and how relevant it was. I know one story that was basically about computer technicians. And like, it was a Soviet computer consultant to an America that was losing the Cold War. It's a pretty good short story. I should track it down sometime. And they were like, you gotta centralize your computers, bro. That's how it goes. And imagine if there was a history where decentralizing the computers worked. Probably not exactly like that, but some kind of shit like that. Like, what if the Cold War went different? You know, I could see some other creative shit. So one of my favorite books I read recently is called The Last Girl Scout by Natalie Ironside. So I'm going to shout her out here because she's just writing like self-publishing basically. If you're into like fucking any kind of shit, like post-apocalypse shit, zombie shit, any of that shit, go on Amazon, look up Natalie Ironside, it's spelled like it sounds. Look up The Last Girl Scout because that shit is fucking raw. It's about like a little bit after the apocalypse, or like a little while after the apocalypse, and like some survivors in Appalachia form a communist state, and they gotta fight fascists in Ohio, and there's fucking zombies and vampires, but it doesn't overwhelm the whole thing. And the main character is a trans Parmesan, and it's rad as fuck. I wrote a review of it. You can look on my Facebook or look on my blog. It's really fucking good. Go look it up. Natalie Ironside, pay her money. Give your money to Natalie Ironside. All right, who else got questions? Dana.
One over here.
So I was thinking about in terms of alternate histories, a lot of them seem to hinge on like what if particular historical moment went different. Like, was wondering if you, I'm pretty sure the name of the book that I'm thinking of is a pretty current one called River of Teeth, I think. That it's about instead of yes, it is. It's instead of substituting a historical moment, it substitutes a technology. That technology being hippopotamuses instead of horses in the Old West. So I was just curious if you had heard of that one and had an opinion on like how that relates to sort of the current trends.
No, I haven't heard of it. It sounds cool. It sounds like a gooder version, it's a gooder version of that dinosaurs in the Old West book.
Gooder.
The dragons one.
Oh, fuck, I didn't even think about it.
But yeah, River of Teeth is supposed to be
Okay, there's a lot of alternate history fiction out there. I didn't read all of it. Alright, we're gonna do like 2 more questions. I see one.
Nope, Drew.
Oh, who's had a hang up a long time?
For the cheap seats.
Leslie, okay, let's do Leslie and then we'll do Drew.
Okay.
Leslie, what's up?
What's a silo?
You'll find out. Drew, what's up?
What's Drew's question?
Yeah, get a beer for Leslie. Alright, what's Drew's question?
He has a question, but he hasn't typed it yet.
Okay, anybody
So.
got a question out? Oh my god, people are yelling!
Everyone's favorite band.
What is your opinion on, like a lot of, it sounds like from the lecture, a lot of the historic fiction that you focused on, or like more accurately mainstream, is U.S. centered. It's all about like U.S. issues, problems. I'm interested, like, just to do a shout out to another great piece of alternative history. What about non-U.S. centered alternate history and how that relates to modern culture? Specifically, my mind is on the 2016 book Judenstaat, which posits that Israel doesn't happen. Instead, what we think of now as East Germany is created as a Jewish. Basically, they do Israel, but in East Germany.
All right, that's cool. You know, that's what the old internet people would have called alien space bats, which is you know, the idea that okay, a butterfly flapping its wings could change history. But to get that history, you need alien space bats. Because there's no way fucking Truman or whoever would have let there be some Jewish state in Eastern Germany to stop the Soviets from fucking bulldogging the Fulda-backs. But that's leaving it aside. Listen, there's a lot of good shit out there, I'm sure. I didn't read all of it. Alright, like, I was doing this birthday lecture. I was doing anti-fascism. I was working a job. I was writing reviews. I was doing all my shit. There's probably a lot of good shit. You know, Chinese sci-fi is off the goddamn chain. Yes! Fucking I see her. Liu Cixin, like, is the shit. Go read some Liu Cixin after you read Natalie Ironside. Liu Cixin's got enough money. Natalie Ironside needs your money. Alright, Sarah.
She's stuck in Gainesville, Florida.
Hell yeah!
Home of Tom Petty. So, Dr. Berard, I mean, one thing that really strikes me as obviously as a through line of you know, many different types of fiction, but this kind of historical revisionism or alternate history is, of course, the sort of suspension of disbelief, right? And it strikes me that it's hard to talk about that concept without talking about the author that maybe most represents that phenomenon of our time, of course, Chuck Tingle. So I'm wondering if there are any connections that you can draw between Mr. Tingle's work, you know, fucked in the ass by Bigfoot. Yeah, Dr. Tingle, yes. Sorry. And the genre of alternate history.
Okay, yeah, I can do that actually. Chuck Tingle, arguably all utopian fiction is alternate history, as is all dystopian fiction. But Charles Tingle lives in a magical fucking utopia where, like, everybody's pounding each other in the butt. Everybody fucking love is actual, all right? And honestly, like, that's kind of the saddest fucking commentary that these kind of come off a little bit like alternate history novels. How actual love is in the Chuck Tingle novels versus how it is IRL. But you know, I will say for Chuck Tingle, the Tingle is doing what he can in his modest way as a dude who writes about dinosaurs and abstract concepts, having butt sex, about the world where love is actual. And there's a prefigurative element to what Chuck Tingle does that you really don't see in a lot of contemporary fiction, right? Or if you do, it's from like fucking nasty fucking Silicon Valley pieces of shit. I don't know. Yeah, I think that's the relationship there. Whereas most alternate history fiction, especially during the end of history fiction and of history fiction and of history era, was all about how the possibilities were limited. And in many respects, love, kind of real, not real, in the way that Chuck Tingle meant. Right? Dinosaurs couldn't pound you in the butt and have it be love. That's a very turtle dove because his imagination was just limited. But Chuck Tingle knows that it can. All right, one more question. Let's make it not stupid. Who's up? Who's up? All right, bad explosion.
All right, Dr. Berard.
Did you see the vegan pizza, by the way?
I will after this.
All right, cool.
As you're writing your speeches for Peterfest, are you actively considering the fact that you will be getting more drunk as you go?
A little?
Thank you.
Okay, everybody.
We have one question from the internet. We have one question from a commenter on the live
from
stream.
Drew.
From Drew, Mr. Drew Edward.
Drew Flaming.
Yeah.
Hey,
Drew. To I'm gonna butcher this one because you put the dyslexic guy in charge of the camera. He wants to know more about the word huontology. Hanutology. Hauntology.
I'm not doing hauntology tonight.
Okay.
Okay, cool. That's good.
Sorry, Drew, I don't have it in me. It's my weakness, not yours.
We had to ask. No worries.
Can you give us a preview of next year's lecture?
No. Oh yeah, next year's lecture probably going to be about the intellectual history of Generation X.
Do it now.
Just sing the Daria theme song.
We're just getting started.